Hello again, Dan Gardner here, and welcome to Module 4 to our Introduction to Global Supply Chain Management class, Product Procurement and Supplier Relationship Management. As I promised in prior modules, we would address in great detail some of the topics that we had built a foundation for. We're really to that point right now. So in this module, we're talking product procurement and SRM, as it's sometimes called, supplier relationship management. This is buy-side stuff, acquisition of product. Maybe it's raw materials because we're a manufacturer. Maybe it's finished goods because we're a wholesaler, but we are acquiring goods. The principles we talk about, the concepts that we talk about remain the same and transcend different types of inventories. For our agenda, we're going to make a distinction between sourcing and purchasing. There's some slight differences there. We'll get into that purchasing function, and again, the emphasis on sales and operations planning, integration, and synchronization. Key elements of SRM. How do we manage our vendors overseas? Strategic considerations and then operational requirements. And again, here's another illustration of we built a foundation earlier, and now we're going into greater detail, the analysis of the purchasing process with some process maps and how they flow and just some practice on how to design good processes and use the right symbology. And then we'll start our introduction on key performance indicators, the metrics of how we measure the performance of our vendors and our own performance as it relates to working with our vendors. So good solid subject, some exciting material, and very important to global supply chain management and sales and operations planning. Here we are again. We saw this slide before a bunch of times. So just to re-emphasize that we're talking sourcing and purchasing, buy-side activities. We saw this a bunch of times too, just re-establishing, as I so often like to do. Different types of inventories are going to influence our activities. Different operating models are going to influence our activities. We have to determine what business we're in, what types of inventories we're dealing with, what our operating models are, and then we can get from the strategic to the tactical. Wow, this is a long definition, but global sourcing and purchasing is really the essence of the buy side of our supply chain activity. So let's hit it, much of which is common sense, but something that we need to build our frame of reference upon. So the business discipline, and these are disciplines, functions of a business, of sourcing and purchasing are closely linked. Why? Because they're both related to the acquisition of goods and services that contribute to the execution of our business model. However, sourcing is a bit more of a strategic function that establishes the criteria, policies, and procedures so purchasing people can go out and select and work with domestic and overseas supplier and understand the rules of the game beforehand. Moving on, executed within the framework of our integrated supply chain, buy-side, sell-side activities. Product sourcing activities could include country, region, industry analysis, the countries that we might consider sourcing from, regions within a large country like India or China, or what industry strengths do specific countries have. That's what we mean by that. Structural analysis of supplier networks, who's out there, who does what, are they tiered, those types of considerations. Are we going to work with a single vendor or conduct a multi-vendor sourcing strategy, kind of a sole or a single source versus multi-source? That's a strategic consideration. How do we manage risk in those environments? What is the logistics and customs infrastructure in those countries from a sourcing perspective? How easy is it to move goods around and get them to a port of export and through export customs? That's what we mean by that. Government regulations and tax codes, vendor profiles, of course, landed cost analysis, cumulative lead times, where the cornerstones that we were talking about, two of them here, really come into play. And of course, human rights and environmental policies. We, as responsible corporate citizens, here in the United States and abroad, part of our sourcing strategy has to consider things like forced labor, slave labor, the inability to form unions. That's what they mean when people talk about human rights. And of course, environmental, green policies? Are our vendors polluting their native countries or home countries unbelievably as they make products for us? We have to be responsible for those things as part of a sourcing strategy. Conversely, purchasing, more execution oriented. It's involved in the actual procurement of raw materials. We went through all of our strategic considerations. We know we're going to buy goods from a supplier in Egypt. We have the rules of the game established, policies, procedures, etc. Now let's get to work and get some purchase orders moving. That's what we're talking about here. So the actual procurement of raw materials, components, subassemblies, finished goods, accessories, again, depending on what inventories we're dealing with or what type of product we're dealing with, that are the result, once again, of ongoing sales and operations planning. So regardless of our business model, we're on the last sentence here, regardless of our business model, purchasing executes on activities that include vendor selection, not countries, but vendors within a country, quality specs for our products, price and quantity negotiation, terms of sale, 30 days credit, 60 days credit, cash in advance, shipping terms, or Incoterms, as we also call them. Do we buy on an ex-works basis? Do we buy on a free carrier basis? Is it delivered duty paid? Those are rhetorical questions at this point, but they're not rhetorical at all when you're dealing with vendors. You have to know that. Cancellation dates on POs, last ship dates. These are all lead time offsetting considerations when you think about it. Chargebacks to vendors, should they not comply with our contractual agreements. Title transfer to us as a buyer. When do we take possession and title to those goods and they're on our balance sheet? Huge financial consideration. Standard operating procedures and documentation requirements. We like to buy a good quality product at a fair price, but we want our vendors to have documentation that makes it easy for us to clear through customs. That's a really important consideration. So lots going on from a sourcing strategic perspective and into a purchasing tactical execution perspective. So let's talk about the integration of purchasing with other S&OP functions. Whether a company, first bullet point, acquires goods through an intercompany purchase where we buy from our own factory, we are the sales department and we acquire goods from our own factories, or from an outside vendor, this whole coordination issue of MRP, which is really what we're talking about here, material requirements planning, with other S&OP activities, it's just so critical. Bills of material, that recipe for products, regardless of whether we make goods ourselves or outsource to a contract manufacturer, there has to be a bill of material. And we're the ones that have to provide it if we're the one buying the product. We might work collaboratively with a vendor to design a bill of material. That's different. But if we're buying, we're involved in the bill of material activity. Purchase order management, that whole process of placing purchase orders for given amounts in certain quantities over time, pure straight up manifestation of the results of gross to net exploding and lead time offsetting. Production planning and master production scheduling, moving further up or cascading back up the supply chain or the manufacturing planning and control graph that we saw so seemingly so long ago. That resonance effect, that integration impact, the cascade, call it as whatever you want. That's what we're saying. Cascading information back and forth, up and down the supply chain. Capacity planning. How much plant capacity do we have? How much plant capacity does our vendor have? These are all integrating functions that have to be built into the purchasing activity. Lead times, logistics planning, all of the above. MRP, last bullet point, is what drives this purchasing function. Now again, we'll make a clarification here, because I did say, and it is true, that MRP, in terms of its strict definition, you're talking about the acquisition of raw materials. That is indeed true. But if we are buying and acquiring finished goods as a wholesaler, the concepts that we use and the tactics that we execute upon are the same. So yeah, the name's a little off. Materials planning definitely associated with raw materials, but for all intents and purposes, and many companies do this, even if they're acquiring finished goods, they'll still call it MRP because it's an inbound function. It's an acquisition function. But I do want to acknowledge and reiterate what I said earlier. MRP, from a technical definition, more a raw materials thing. But in the end, we're talking about purchasing. We're talking about acquiring inventory. So the things like gross to net exploding, lead time offsetting, it's the same, whether it's raw materials or finished goods.